Have you ever wondered what India would be like if it had never been colonized by the British? Would the history, culture, and politics of India be drastically different if it had remained independent? Without colonial rule, India's society may have evolved on its own terms, preserving indigenous practices and traditions. The impact of British imperialism on India's economy cannot be overlooked. Would India have experienced economic growth and development without colonization? The British brought modern systems of administration and education to India, but at the cost of exploiting its resources and people. The caste system, which played a prominent role in Indian society, might have undergone a different trajectory without outside interference. Would India have had a more unified identity without the British instilling divisions between different religious and linguistic groups? The struggle for independence may have been different without the catalyst of British rule, but would it have been any less fervent? Imagine a world where India had never experienced the devastating partition that led to widespread violence and the creation of Pakistan. Would the concept of nonviolence and civil disobedience, championed by leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, still have shaped India's struggle for freedom? Without the British, would India have seen a rise in its own indigenous industries and trade, protected from foreign competition? The Raj era left an indelible mark on India's architecture, landscape, and even its cuisine. Would these have looked different without colonization? The British introduced cricket to India, a sport that has become a national obsession. Would another sport have taken its place? Could India have become an economic powerhouse earlier, rivaling countries like China, if it had not been held back by colonialism? How would India's borders and territories have been defined without British-drawn boundaries, which continue to spark conflicts even today? Freedom fighters like Jawaharlal Nehru, Bhagat Singh, and Subhas Chandra Bose might not have risen to prominence without the struggle against British rule. Could India have remained a collection of independent princely states, never forming a united nation if it had escaped British imperialism? The suppression of Indian culture and education under colonial rule had lasting effects. Would India's artistic and intellectual output be different? Would Indian literature and cinema have evolved differently, free from the influence of Western storytelling and aesthetics? Without British intervention, how would India have dealt with pressing social issues like gender inequality, poverty, and caste discrimination? The impact of the British on the Indian economy, infrastructure, and institutions cannot be underestimated. What would have emerged in their absence? The Indian national movement against the British fueled a sense of unity and national pride. Would that spirit have been ignited without colonization? The British introduced modern technology and industries to India. Would India have embraced industrialization on its own? Could India have been spared from the horrendous famines and agricultural disruptions caused by British policies? The Indian education system might have followed a different trajectory without the influence of British colonial ideologies and curriculum. The preservation of local languages, art forms, and traditional knowledge may have flourished without the imposition of English as the official language. British rule in India provided an impetus for social reforms and movements. Would these have emerged organically without colonial pressures? The caste system, which perpetuated social inequality, might have seen a different trajectory without British manipulation and interference. India's rich history and heritage might have been preserved more authentically without British looting and plundering of cultural artifacts. Would India have forged stronger ties with other Asian countries and explored alternative models of governance if it hadn't been colonized? The Indian diaspora, which spread around the world, might not exist in the same magnitude if India had remained independent. The British introduced a modern legal system in India. What would India's legal framework look like without colonial influences? Could India have become a hub for innovation and scientific advancements if it had not faced the consequences of technological exploitation during colonialism? The British legacy in India is complicated. There were advancements, but at the cost of immense suffering and subjugation. Speculating on what India would be like without British colonization is an exercise in imagining a different timeline, with its own set of challenges and possibilities. The history of British colonization in India is intertwined with the history of the world. Altering one aspect would have ripple effects globally. Ultimately, it is impossible to fully grasp the extent of the changes that would have occurred if India had never been colonized by the British.